Hello and welcome everyone. My name's Chris Kerr and this is the third Marine Economy Week from Harper McLeod. I lead our Marine Economy group and I'm joined today by three of my fellow partners. James McMorrow, who heads up our commercial and regulatory team, Omar Ali, who is in our renewables team, and Tony Cameron, who focuses on financing and vessels. Marine economy is a diverse economy. It's one that covers lots of different types of business and interest, but all caught within a similar guise of ones that are interested in water. So for us, it's everything about fishing, aquaculture, vessels, shipping, and ports and harbours. There's obviously been lots going on in that sector over the last few years, and what we thought we would do as the precursor to the week is start with a year in review discussion. Just before we get to that, just to give a nod to what we've got coming up later in the week, we're going to be talking about economic regeneration. We've got an online trip to one of the pelagic trawlers based at Shetland, based out of Lerwick. We're going to be looking at innovation in the sector, as well as a report on the recently announced green free ports being released. More information will be available on the website, and we do encourage you please to tune in over the course of the week. But as I said, before we start, we thought for today's purposes, just a kind of an introduction to the week and to what's been happening would be a year in review. Because it's such a wide sector, we thought what we should do is break this into three different headings. So the three headings for purposes of this discussion are ports and harbours, offshore, natural capital and renewables, and fishing, aquaculture and vessels. So to kick us off on the ports and harbours piece, I'll maybe come to you, Tony. There's been lots going on in that sector, in particular, I suppose, kicking off with investment generally.
Yes, Chris, we've found over the last 12 months, as has been the case for quite a while, that we've acted for a range of owners, investors and funders in relation to projects involving ports and harbours infrastructure. Just picking a couple of examples, there's the Ardersier port site, which is being transformed into a offshore wind and sort of wider energy transition hub. It's a 45-acre site and it's the subject of £300 million of investment by Quantum Energy Partners backing the new owner, Haventus. So that's quite an exciting project, and that's been pushed on a stage by recently joining into the Inverness and Cromarty Firth Green Free Port, which is one of the two successful green free ports that were announced. Chris, I know you'll touch on that slightly more, but I think that will sort of push on that opportunity significantly. And certainly the CEO of Haventus described the green free port as the most exciting energy opportunity for Scotland and the UK since the discovery of North Sea oil and gas. Another transaction worth mentioning is the Kishorn Port Limited, which is jointly owned by Leiths and Ferguson Freight Holdings, who both got operations there. The project there to effectively carry out investigations to see what else can be done in terms of developing the port, pier structures, load-bearing capacity and storage, with a view again to really maximising the opportunities that come out of ScotWind that Omar speak about, oil and gas decommissioning and the growth in infrastructure in aquaculture, as well as the wider circular economy piece.
Thanks, Tony. I suppose the last point you raised about green free ports is just worth picking up on. So our audience may be aware that the two successful bid winners for the free ports competition in Scotland were announced in January 23, and so that went to Inverness and Cromarty Firth and Forth in Edinburgh. The boundaries of these ports have still to be finalised completely, but essentially these will be tax and customs trading zones. Already, just tying into the point about this kind of the drive for investment, already there's been a couple of big announcements made in relation to the Inverness green free port. So we've seen Sumitomo, Japanese subsea cable manufacturer, announcing a significant investment for the creation of a manufacturing facility up in the Nigg area. And we've also heard that associated British ports are looking at a significant investment in the area as well. So if this is a sign of things to come, then that's got to be positive for Scotland and for the inward investment piece. One of the things we're releasing over the course of this week is a report on 2 stakeholder dinners we held in Edinburgh and Inverness for each of these green free ports, where we had a number of local stakeholders giving their views on the opportunities that present themselves. So keep an eye out for the report being released over the course of the week. Just maybe if I take a slightly step back and talk more generally about what's going on from a kind of macro or maybe more public sector Scottish Government perspective. James, your team has been involved in significant economic regeneration projects around ports.
Yes, it's clear that the marine economy continues to play a key role in relation to wider economic regeneration, and that often that will be led by local and or central government, and certainly in the past year we've been involved in a range of local government projects that have been designed to facilitate either physical regeneration of brownfield sites or moribund or mothballed infrastructure, or to create wider economic development opportunities, particularly in the travel, tourism and renewables sectors. And we've been involved in projects the length and breadth of Scotland, including in Glasgow, Edinburgh and the Lothians, Inverclyde, Ayrshire, Aberdeen and the Highlands and Islands. Some notable examples include projects in Inverclyde, led by the Inverclyde Council, in relation to Ocean Terminal and Inchgreen Marine, which are excellent examples of projects designed to improve marine infrastructure but also drive wider economic regeneration. We're also working with Orkney Islands Council in relation to the Scapa Flow Deepwater Quay project, which is a very significant infrastructure project which will be designed to redevelop Scapa Flow Deepwater Quay and link into the very significant offshore wind infrastructure opportunities that are available. And it's been notable that these projects, although public sector led, have often involved quite interesting and innovative funding and corporate partnerships with the private sector. So definitely an area to watch in the coming year, I think.
And I suppose just one of the points you alluded to was that some of the investment that's being deployed by the port and harbour facilities is all geared towards the cruise liner market.
Yes, that's right. And as I mentioned, Ocean Terminal was a project that was designed to try to increase cruise liner and cruise vessel activity in Inverclyde, and a project that was already bearing fruit. So I think the linkages between the marine economy and wider travel and tourism sectors is significant.
That doesn't seem to be a day goes by that you don't seem to hear that Lerwick or Invergordon or Greenock have had their highest cruise liner numbers for some time. Interesting to see then, you would have noticed at the weekend that the Scottish Green Party have announced that they intend to try to tax the most polluting vessels. So it'll be interesting to see the kind of knock-on effect from that if that were to come to fruition. Okay, thanks, James. Maybe slightly changing direction. Suppose talk about legislative developments that have affected the ports. We ran a webinar earlier in the year in relation to EIRs. Tell us more.
Yeah, so the EIRs are the Environmental Information Regulations. That's the legislation that governs the way in which public authorities handle and disseminate and make available environmental information. And in a landmark decision of the Scottish Information Commissioner earlier on this year, the Commissioner decided that Cromarty Firth Port Authority was a Scottish public authority for the purposes of the Environmental Information Regulations. And that means that the Port Authority, and indeed all port and harbour authorities in Scotland will need to treat themselves as being subject to the environmental information regulations. And that means they'll be under a range of specific statutory obligations to actively disseminate environmental information that they hold and also respond to requests for that information in accordance with a statutory framework and in accordance with statutory timescales. So it will undoubtedly be a case of port and harbour authorities having to get up to speed with the terms of that legislation, what it means for them, and putting arrangements in place to facilitate compliance with that legislation. As you mentioned, we ran a webinar on this subject earlier on this year, and it's certainly an area in which we're starting to increasingly have to advise our Ports and Harbour Authority clients in relation to compliance. So again, an area to watch in the year to come.
Big implications. I suppose sticking with that theme, Tony, your team's also seen extended application of relatively new legislation when it comes to ports.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. The National Security and Investment Act, not exclusive to marine economy by any stretch, but certainly saying on a number of transactions. The Act, for those who don't know, is effectively to give the UK government powers to intervene and scrutinise certain deemed high-risk transactions to protect national security. The Act came into force at the beginning of 2021, and I say we're seeing quite a bit of that now. Effectively focuses on, as far as notifiable acquisitions, which are those that need to be notified to UK government to approve, focusing 17 specified areas of the economy, very wide range of areas, but picking a few that could apply to marine economy, critical suppliers to government, defence, energy and transport. So you can see where it could quite easily impact marine economy transactions. As I say, there is a regime for requiring to notify effectively corporate transactions to UK government when they fall into certain parameters. The Act also references qualifying assets, which is acquisition of assets rather than corporate transactions, albeit they don't require to be notified on a mandatory basis. Whenever a notification is made to government, though, there are quite regulated timescales which need to be built into any transaction where this is in contemplation. And as far as transactions go, we're seeing that quite a conservative view has been taken of the need to notify government, even if it isn't mandatory, in order that, in particular, funders can get comfortable that the transaction is not open to any form of challenge. Supposed to give a little bit of flavour of the Act to date. The Cabinet Office issued an annual report for the year ended 31st March 2023, and there were 866 notifications, 671 mandatory, 180 voluntary and 15 retrospective. But of those, only 43 notifications that were rejected. So a relatively small proportion, but it shows you the high numbers that are going through as far as the market goes. So an interesting piece of legislation that we're seeing impacting transactions and marine economy transactions more and more.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, changing tack slightly, Omar, let's bring you into the conversation. We've heard a lot about the investment in ports and harbours. James alluded earlier to the fact that this is in a large part for the offshore renewable market. We couldn't do a discussion like this without talking about Scotland. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, earlier this year, the Crown Estate Scotland gave approval for companies to help cut North Sea carbon emissions by developing floating offshore wind projects that can power oil and gas rigs. So 8 companies, which include the investment arm of BP and the UK-listed oil firm Harbour Energy, will pay a total of £262 million in option fees once agreements are finalised next year for the chance to build 13 offshore wind projects totalling potentially 5.5 gigawatts, so quite a significant amount of capacity. Agreements have been awarded to 8 full-scale offshore wind projects that plan to supply electricity directly to oil and gas platforms, as well as 5 small-scale wind projects that will provide test beds for innovation and new technologies that are not ready to be rolled out on a commercial scale at the moment. So the projects will go through the usual planning, consenting, financing stages, and projects will only progress to full seabed leases once all the various stages have been completed. So the Crown Estate would then be expected to make further revenues from the Scottish Government from rental payments once the wind farms begin operating, and that could stretch to between 25 and 50 years. I mean, it's worth mentioning that the North Sea oil industry is under pressure to cut carbon emissions and are turning to floating offshore wind technologies to replace gas and diesel generators that are usually power their rigs, because floating wind turbines can generate electricity even in the very, very deep areas of the UK continental shelf. And we've also seen this year the results of the 5th Contracts for Difference auction, where it was hoped about 5 gigawatts of offshore wind projects would be awarded, but not a single offshore wind project bid into the auction. And also we've seen increasing costs of everything from turbines to labour to financing. And these are issues that we will explore further on the Renewable Energy Day with Paul O'Brien of Deep Wind.
Okay, thanks, Omar. Energy security is something we probably shouldn't neglect to mention. So you touched upon oil and gas there. The Rosebank oil field has been consented to, or granted a licence. I think I've got it right that there are circa 100 other oil and gas licences are intended to be consented. Any thoughts about what you see that looking like for offshore or more specifically ports and harbours?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the government had said it was energy security that was a priority for the go-ahead of these sort of large oil fields, and that they would be less emissions intensive than older oil and gas developments by basically electrifying the extraction process. But what the impact that would have is that ports that were ready to perhaps decommission some of these assets will not be in a position to do so. So they need to be thinking about what's going to happen in the next 10, 15 years when they would be expecting some of these rigs to come back and be decommissioned.
And I suppose the part to that is that there's a lot of the investment that has been occurring has been in anticipation of the decommissioning happening.
That's right. Yeah, it is, and many will argue that it's basically the award of these licenses has contravened the plan for a net zero economy and watered down interim plans for the government's 2050 net zero targets, and it could also encourage other countries to rein in their own climate ambitions as well.
Okay, very interesting. Thanks, Omar. Tony, your team has been doing a bit in the Weave and Tidal device side, so just linking on from what Omar was saying there, offshore.
Yeah, I suppose just going back to the renewables and the push towards transition to net zero, after Omar's had to say about the impact of oil and gas side of things. A few years ago we were involved Acting for Abundance Investment, which is an ethical crowdfunding platform in relation to the construction of a 2 megawatt tidal turbine, which is located at ENEC in Orkney. It was a follow-on of a prototype that it generated more electricity in the first year than Scotland's entire wave and tidal sector had done in the preceding 12 years. So it was really moving things on significantly. So we were again involved earlier this year in the refinance and raising further debt funding in order to fund the operational phase of this project. So the turbine's now expected to offset 2,000 tonnes of CO2 per year and power 1,700 homes. Part of the transaction we were involved in involved Scottish National Investment Bank coming on board with the project. Then they see that aligned with their mission to support the just transition to net zero and to invest in innovative, unique, scalable technology. I think that wave and tidal is quite interesting as far as being it's abundant, it's predictable, and I think there's a real opportunity there for that to grow as a part of the energy mix as well.
Omar, okay, just changing tack slightly. Another item that's been in the news a lot and has a lot of publicity in the last year or so is all of the discussion about protected marine areas. Do you want to tell us a wee bit about that?
Yeah, sure. As part of the Butte House Agreement, which brought the Scottish Greens into government in a power sharing deal with the SNP, ministers had planned to designate at least 10% of Scotland's seas as highly protected marine areas by 2026. So that meant that all forms of fishing, including recreational catch and release, angling, would be prohibited in selected sites. Seaweed harvesting would also be banned. No new marine renewable energy schemes would be allowed, and the laying of subsea cables would be restricted, all in the bid to protect the environment. Now, as you can imagine, members of the fishing industry and some island communities raised fierce objections to the proposals. The Scottish Government confirmed a few months ago that the current plans would not be progressed, and instead the Government will consult further with the industry communities and conservation organisations about a new pathway and timetable.
Thanks, Omar. So even although the consultator is now back out to consultation, is there any evidence that, we talked earlier about inward investment, is there any evidence of that private sector inward investment has been thwarted or postponed as a result of that?
What's happened is that there has been significant private investment happening in Scotland over the last year. Essex-based XLCC were granted planning permission this year by North Ayrshire Council for its proposed high voltage direct current subsea cable manufacturing plant at Hunterston to take advantage of the growing renewables industry. And that plant will support 900 jobs, and thousands more will be supported through the wider supply chain. Work is scheduled to start next year, and cable production will begin in 2026. And Chris, you mentioned earlier about Japan's Sumitomo Electric Industries, who announced plans to build a cable factory in the Highlands at Nigg on the Cormity Firth, and those cables will be used to connect offshore wind farm developments, and is expected to bring £200 million worth of investment and create 150 highly skilled green jobs.
So in the face of it, there still seems to be investment going on in relation to that area, notwithstanding where we got to in the protected marine area piece. Just, James, then from your point of view, what's the comparison if we then flip to the public sector in terms of funding for offshore projects or renewables projects?
Our experience in relation to public sector funding for renewables projects, and indeed for the wider marine sector, is generally fairly positive, and we've seen evidence of our clients, both in the public and private sector, being able to access a range of public sector funding, whether that's through City Region Deal, Marine Fund Scotland, or FLOMUS, which relates specifically to UK government funding for offshore wind manufacturing infrastructure. We've also been involved in discussions between our clients and both the Scottish National Investment Bank and the UK Infrastructure Bank in relation to funding of marine projects. So it certainly seems, based on our experience, that there is a range of public sector funding available for marine economy projects, whether in the renewable sector or in the wider sector. And certainly the direction of policy travel from both Scottish and UK governments appears to be that there is a firm commitment to continued public sector investment in the marine economy, recognising all of the very significant benefits that it has for Scotland and the UK. And I would hope and expect that funding will continue to be available.
Okay, thanks, James. So moving on to the third and final session of today's discussion is fishing, aquaculture and vessels. Like all of the other topics we've discussed, this covers a really broad spectrum. So I suppose, Tony, I would maybe just start by asking you, what is it that's caught your attention over the last year in relation to fishing matters that you've seen?
So the main thing, Chris, relates to fishing quotas, where the UK has reached agreement with EU, Norway and other coastal states in relation to the UK fishing industry. So that's involved securing fishing catch limits of 202 million for the UK fishing industry, which is 33 million up on the previous year. There's also catch limits negotiated with North East Atlantic states, and that gave rise to a UK quota for the fishing industry that's worth £256 million, of which just over 146 million relates to the Scottish fishing industry. Both the Scottish Government and the UK Government's press releases were emphasising heavily the importance of responsible and sustainable catch limit management, and referenced the scientific advice of the International Committee for the Exploration of the Seas.
Right, thanks, Tony. I think there was also a case went through the Scottish courts in relation to fishing during the year.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. Effectively, the pelagic fishing industry, obviously one of our colleagues has recorded a video tour of one of the vessels, which said appearing later in the week. The case effectively relates to the economic link provisions that tie into fishing quotas. Previously, the link related to a number of different conditions, but one of those was in relation to the proportion of catch that needed to be in the UK. That's now been changed by the Scottish Government as of 1st January 2023 to relate to a link to Scotland, and a link which is increased in proportion, and that's effectively where the pelagic industry has taken issue. So the Shetland Fish Producers Organisation and the Scottish Fishermen's Organisation raised an action effectively challenging this and the impact it would have on the economics of that industry because of the proportion of catch that occurs elsewhere, in particular in relation to Norway, and because of the price differential. There was initially an attempt to interdict the new rules come into place. That failed earlier this year, but the case subsequently held in September and focused on three areas, effectively the argument between the distinction between shoreside benefits and fishing industry benefits, the basis of the consultation, and an argument around human rights and effectively quiet enjoyment. So that case has now been heard and the judgment's awaited. So it's been quite a big issue in the industry, as you can imagine. So, Chris, you've got a session this week in relation to fishing and aquaculture. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I've recorded a session with three organisations. So we've got the Chief Exec of Salmon Scotland, Tavish Scott. We've got the Chief Executive of the Shetland Fish Producers Organisation, that's Brian Isbister. And we've also got the editor of Fishing News joining us, Andy Reid. So the three individuals are in conversation with me, and we're going to be tackling all of the current issues that these individuals see across that spectrum. I anticipate that a couple of areas that will be discussed will be similar to the one you've mentioned, which will be the kind of post-Brexit world, but also the sustainability in relation to particularly farmed salmon and all that goes with it. So that will be later in the week. And one of the big news stories in relation to aquaculture specific over the last year was the Scottish Government's paper in relation to sustainable fish farming. So that will be one of the main talking points.
Is there anything else that's got your eye in terms of aquaculture industry over the last 12 months, Chris?
Yeah, I think if I was trying to kind of compartmentalise it, it would probably be there's been quite a lot of internationalisation going on. So our corporate M&A team have been busy in terms of transactions where we are transacting for clients in the aquaculture and vessels market. There seems to be there's probably like the gap appears to me to be getting slightly wider between the large international or larger players in each of those spaces as opposed to the smaller independent operators. So, for example, we're seeing independent fish farms being taken over by the larger fish farm operators, some of whom, but not all of whom, are owned overseas. We're seeing consolidation amongst clients that have fleets of work boats that service the fish farms, and they are often, again, but not exclusively, owned overseas. it seems to be this kind of drive towards market share or market dominance. I think the other thing that is probably playing into that sector as well, and we talked about this earlier in our discussion, is probably just the availability of funding. So there doesn't seem to be a day goes by where you don't hear, for example, on the fish processing side, the aquaculture processing side, that certain businesses are looking to extend their facilities, and quite a lot of that is through government grants and public money. Seems to be available, particularly in the more fragile and rural areas in which we've got a lot of our offices. So that those seem to be some kind of themes that are coming through. That is excluding the theme of, again, if I just stick with the fragile and rural areas, that's excluding the themes of staff and labour shortages, but also what goes with that, particularly in those rural areas, is the lack of housing for the staff and labour. So they seem to be kind of constants that come up frequently. Tony, I mentioned the fact that we've seen quite a bit of activity in the corporate world when it comes to workboats and vessels, and that's all supply chain to the farming industry and the aquaculture world. Your team does a lot in relation to vessels more generally. What kind of patterns or types of work have you seen a lot over the last year or so?
Yeah, the team does a lot in relation to buying and selling, funding and new ship builds, and that's covered a range of jurisdictions, and it's always an international industry that's covered a range of jurisdictions in terms of shipyards, etc. over the last 12 months. In terms of legislation, not a new piece of legislation from 2019, but the new regulations brought in 29th of March 2019 that effectively relate to extending eligibility in respect of the UK flag. So broadly falls into two categories. First is widening eligibility of potential owners of UK flag vessels, which previously related only to European Economic Area, and British overseas territories as well as the UK. That's a much wider grouping now, although much was made of trying to reinforce the fact that none of this will impact effectively the quality of the UK flagging and all of the checks and processes that need to go with that. So ship owners and managers don't need to have any UK presence other than just effectively a correspondence address. The second element, we've seen quite a lot of this of late, which is the reason for raising it now, and although this legislation is a few years old, I think post-Brexit it's taken a while for this to come through, is the ability to bareboat charter UK vessels in other jurisdictions, which was previously limited and impacted the security of the vessels because they had to be deflagged from the UK. So this changes, we've seen really sort of coming into its own of late, and we've done a lot of work in relation to that respect so that the vessel effectively has its primary flag maintained, but as a secondary flagging, which then doesn't impact the security over that vessel. So we see that as a real pattern and something I think that will continue apace.
And is availability for funding of new build vessels still seeming to be quite buoyant?
Yeah, I think that continues to be pretty strong. There's not a huge volume of funders who are in this market, still in Scotland, but the funders that are in the market are very strongly supportive of it. And as I say, we've supported shipbuilds right across various jurisdictions, and that's an area that's keeping us very busy.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, I'm conscious of time, and hopefully that has kept your attention for the last wee while. You will have picked up that trying to pull together what is a very diverse sector is quite challenging to make sure that we cover as many areas as possible. We hopefully also didn't include too many puns in our discussions. Meantime, thank you to James, thank you to Omar, thank you to Tony. The details of the rest of the week are on your screen. We hope you can join us for some or all of that. And of course, if there's any feedback in relation to future content or areas you feel that we could have gone into more detail on or would like to see more of for future marine economy content, we'd be happy to get that feedback. So for the time being, thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.